they can watch everything later. So I think there are so many questions. Probably it's better to start as soon as possible.
Okay, well, let's get started then. Thank you both, Carol and Harriina, for these wonderful presentations. And I hope that the participants agree that they really expand on some of the things that were discussed this morning and looked at them in a larger, more sort of philosophical context, and maybe deepen some of these more pragmatic questions. So I thought they were both really, really interesting. I wondered whether to start off, obviously the presentations this morning by Mara and Jacqueline already provide a sort of way of thinking of an alternative in terms of materials, and the question of animal products was mentioned a few times. I was wondering to which extent the people who are present have other examples of where initially at a pragmatic level there are different modes of approaching the tools and the materials of mokuhanga. Carol mentioned one of her students using plant products from her garden to make ink. I was recently teaching in Oslo, and one of the students did exactly the same thing. Here in Helsinki, I had not a mokuhanga student necessarily, but I know students have been experimenting with making their own inks. Because we're in Finland, one has been using, now what are they called in English? Now I can't think of English. Blueberries. There are lots of blueberries in Finland. So she has made quite a successful attempt at printing with blueberries. So these are just examples I've come across, but you've all got, between us, we've got so much more experience and encounters with students and colleagues trying things out. So I was curious about whether there are other alternatives lurking there. No.
Jacqueline, I think you can talk,
Okay, thank you. Yeah, just following up, I guess, flowing off from what Ruth said, and also Wan Jian talking about the different binders, I guess, or ways of making ink. Is Carol back? Carol's there. Hi. Yeah, I noticed your student, you said, was using the plants from her allotment to make inks, and I noticed on the notes it had vinegar and bicarb of soda. Do you know more about how she was making those recipes or inks?
She's very interested in sort of alternative medicine as well. So she has a huge knowledge of the medicinal qualities of plants, which I understand actually goes hand in hand with the pigments. I think that was one of the things that they were talking about in I think Henry Smith's lecture. He was talking about how often the pigments and medicines were sold in the same shop. They're the same product, different purposes. So I thought that was quite interesting too. So I mean, I think she has a very good working knowledge of plants and their properties and how they can be used. So she's she's just sort of messing. I don't know how fugitive they would be. I mean, how light fugitive they would be over time. But it's certainly something that she was very keen to try. I also had another student who he worked for the Museum of London, and he had undertaken a whole survey along the Thames embankment in London. And he did his mokuhanga prints by taking samples of Thames mud and turning that into ink and printing his prints with these inks that he'd made, which is amazing. I feel like I'm just an observer, a facilitator.
Yeah, I'm not such an expert on the area of pigments, but it's interesting, that line between dyes and pigments, because here Indigenous artists, they use the roots of plants, but they use those as dyes, so they use the dyes.
You've muted
You've gone, Jacqueline, you're muted again.
Yeah, sorry, so I repeat. So I'm not such an expert in pigments and dyes, but it's interesting. There's a line, I guess, where it becomes a dye and a pigment, and that's why I was interested that she was using plants, because Aboriginal artists here, they use the roots of plants, and they use those for a dyeing process. So not so much in painting, but in terms of dyeing fabrics or dyeing their weavings for baskets. So yeah, that's all. I was kind of curious about that.
I suppose I was wondering, and you know, there's a lot in both presentations that we can draw out, hopefully. But talking about plants and pigments, etc. I suppose, Harriina, you are focused, that's your project, on the animal, and I guess with the whole discussion of different approaches and adopting more environmentally aware approaches across the board, I suppose there is the question, where do we stop? And the animals that you have mentioned are all mammals. You know, I'm sort of would ask, what about insects? You know, and other creatures. Where does the non-human stop? And what about plants, for example? You know, so I mean, obviously, that is your focus. So I totally appreciate that. But I guess that's a sort of larger question. I wonder, where do we stop?
Exactly, and that's a very good question to think about, and because also what I have been thinking, for example, about the mokuhanga brushes, that synthetic brushes are actually not better at all, because then they are like, then comes the ecological questions of using fossil fuels and raw oil and so on. And I think, like, making art, you always need to use materials, and yeah, so there's no like clear answers to this. And of course, like different plants, there's also like all kinds of problematics in this as well. For example, we have been talking a lot about Koso paper and the fibers of this, that there's like a strong like lack of good Koso fibers. And I think then it comes to the problems of our societies, that how we are using land, that we are not giving space for the plants, for the animals. So these are like broader problematics and questions of how do we live as human beings, and that's not sustainable. I don't think the main problem is that we use animal-based products. Also, I don't think that mokuhanga and the materials of mokuhanga are actually very big problem for the climate or for the animals. The problem is the way we live in the modern societies, and that's not sustainable. Like, yeah, I come from quite like, I don't want to say primitive family, but like from a very like a more like hunter-gatherer family from the north of Finland. So I'm kind of used to, you know, I was wearing like furs that my father was hunting, because it was like deadly freezing, like -25 so often. So, and I don't think that's like a huge problem, but the way we, like the industrialization of animals and how we kind of use animals as, in the mass production, like the objectification and utilization. I think that's the problem, and also that we don't give space for the wild animals and the wild plants, and yeah.
Yeah, I think, and also the point you were making about matter as something that is passive, that and I think in terms of the discussions, how artists relate, and I think especially the Japanese attitude is quite different there in terms of its encounter with tools and the respect for tools and their use. So in a sense, that's quite an example almost that we haven't had so much.
Exactly. For example, Craig from Awagami Factory, he said in one interview that in Japan, people traditionally think that washi is something which is alive, that it's a living thing. And
yeah.
I think this is what we could think about the mokuhanga prints in general, and all the matter and the agencies in the prints in general. And but kind of the key point that I was trying to make in the presentation was that art is actually very powerful. So that's kind of why I think it matters what kind of materials we use, because they carry like very big cultural significance, artworks, I mean.
Absolutely, yes. I think there's some very nice comments in the box. Natasha, maybe could you maybe say this for everybody? I don't know. Otherwise, everybody has to sort of go through. Is Natasha there?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah. Could you maybe tell us what you wrote? Right. So.
Okay, sure. I just thank Harriina for bringing the animal-based products to our attention. I think we talk a lot about mokuhanga as ecologically friendly, and it's really good for us to actually interrogate that. And what she brings forth is, she highlights this idea of a deeper level of our connectedness to materials, animals, and the natural world. And I love the conclusions that she brings forth about the living nature of our artwork. And I think those are just, they're incredibly, I mean, on a superficial level, they're very poetic, but poetry and art is about getting us to move to deeper places of interrogation. I mean, that is what helps us develop as human beings. And I was just very struck by the incredibly sensitive nature of her research. So thank you.
Great. Lovely, yeah. I think that also connects the two presentations this afternoon, because Carol, in a way, you brought out that entanglement or interconnectedness in mokuhanga really beautifully as well. And I don't know whether you want to say a bit more, and maybe in response to now having heard Harriina's presentation, how you how you respond to that, maybe.
In terms of interconnectedness with materials, or
yeah.
I mean, well, sort of my paper was sort of more of an interrogation about the sense of touch, I think, and I think it's more about how we've I think we were talking about this earlier about we were talking about writing. I think Ralph, you were talking about writing and calligraphy. I kind of, it was very early for me, so I kind of caught the tail end of that. But I find that it's quite extraordinary that, you know, some of my students are on the computer all day long and with their jobs, and then they don't write. Let alone draw, and interconnectedness goes into our own bodies as well as, you know, into species, but we're not actually connected with our own bodies if we lose a sense of touch. And it's by I find if I am on the computer too long, my hands get itchy. I'm not doing enough. So I think it's very important, and I think we lose it at our peril.
Yeah, that's this sense of time and touch. I think that seems to have undergone quite a change for, you know, I get the impression for a lot of people, it's certainly something that is discussed at all kinds of different levels. And I know in Britain, initially it was cooking that took off in an great way. I don't know whether that was the same in other countries. Everybody was talking about cooking and making their own bread, etc. Yeah, so I think, yeah, touch, and I suppose touch is connected with an idea of presence as well. And I'm quite interested how that might change as a consequence of COVID and the experiences that we've had in front of screens that have made us value, I mean, for want of a better word, real presence and the actual encounter with a physical encounter with a person. So I was wondering, some of the things that you so sensitively described, what are other people's experiences in terms of changes in terms of their own practice, or maybe again the experience through teaching, that reports from students, what has changed for them in terms of their engagement with making work? We had we had a few examples, I think, of that. So what are other people's experiences or reports back from students? What has changed for them in terms of, this making or encounter with materials and things, processes? Sorry, that was probably not a very clear question. Shall I try and repeat it more clearly? Oh, hi. Yeah. Natasha?
Well, I was just seeing Carol's paper as a very beautiful touch point for Harriina's paper, in that Carol brought out the point that there has been a sort of a growing interest in Japanese culture internationally. And I think that was a really fascinating draw card into the fact that around Mokuhanga we now have this kind of social or sort of cultural awareness growing, and that in a way it's another kind of way in which the particularly the British culture is touching Japanese culture. There's this touching of minds in a way, and a discovery of connection and interest. And then, Harriina taking that idea of touch right down into the actual way in which materials touch each other in the process of print. And I think one of the things that Carol pointed out that was also was sort of something that I think her and I both experienced when we were at the MeLab residency, was the way that it was being described that a print was being made as something that happens in the touch between the block and the paper. And there's actually a South African academic that's written a beautiful paper about that whole aspect of print and touch. So I just wanted to say thank you, Carol, for sort of contextualizing that within your own environment in London. I found that really, really lovely.
Ruth, Elizabeth had something to say a little bit earlier.
Oh, sorry. How come I missed that? I'm so sorry. Elizabeth?
Yeah, actually, I lowered my hand. But I'm just thinking about this ethical issue, that I come from a country where we don't have so many plants, at least not all the year. So I feel this use of animal and fish is part of, deeply rooted in our culture.
Oh, interesting.
And then I also read about making nikawa, that traditionally the people who did this, they were kind of outcasts of the society, and they were not touchable in a way.
In Japan.
Because they were dealing with dead animals.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's very interesting to bring in how geographical differences might add another layer to this. I was also, I suppose, the idea of touch, and there's nothing, you know, that I would contradict in Carol's paper, or Harriina's for that matter. I totally understand what you're saying, and I think it's really important. At the same time, and I would see this as being both, not one or the other. The whole idea of touch has, of course, you know, I think we have to be careful not to essentialize it. And what the point that you're making, Elizabeth, brings that home, that historically, you know, there were untouchables, or the whole question of touch can be quite complex. Who or what do we touch, when and for how long? What kind of touch? Touch can also be violent. Maybe we don't call it touch then, but it's still a form of touch. And so in some, and the whole notion of contact, I mentioned earlier today, Jennifer Roberts' lecture. The first lecture on, or the whole lecture series is called Contact, but she's very careful also to show the doubleness of any of the concepts that she discusses. So contact also implies absence. It implies a distance. So in a sense, that is also part of touch. So I guess what am I trying to say? Yeah, not to overemphasize one aspect of touch over another. Yeah, otherwise it becomes all sort of hunky-dory, cozy, which I think is a bit dangerous, personally. So that's just a comment. I'm not sure if anybody else has any. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, though, that you're talking about touch as being an essential and maybe talking about its veracity, but
sorry, no, I was saying we mustn't essentialize touch.
Yes, exactly. So on that point, I wanted to talk about how the screen has become quite an effective proxy for touch. And if you read Laura Marks, she talks about the caressing gaze or the haptic gaze, so that our eyes traveling over the surface of the thing that we're seeing. And yesterday, Hilary talked about embossing paper, and she showed very dramatically how a very tactile object can be conveyed with the casting of shadows. And I think everybody who viewed her talk would have understood the dimensionality of this object, which was mediated through the screen. And I'm really fascinated by the idea that we're really fallible to touch as well. So we can trick our bodies into believing that we're feeling something velvety when we're not, or that you should try this, look it up. The cutaneous rabbit illusion is where somebody touches your forearm in two places. And if they do it rhythmically, you feel like the rabbit is jumping along your arm. So there's this kind of idea that our brains are so easily fooled. So we're tapping into all these things with mokuhanga because we use our fingertips very much. But I think there is another dimension that does translate through this strange digital medium.
Well, that's, I mean, that's the other point that has been made, that, you know, our digital objects are becoming more sensitive to touch, more responsive to touch. That's the other side, that our technologies themselves incorporate touch. But so I suppose, yeah, there is a question, what makes the difference? And I don't know, Laura Marks talks about the haptic and the optical sense of touch, and we need both. So in the sense, because one question I had in terms of mokuhanga, I guess from the point of making, you know, we talk obviously for good reasons a lot about the making of it, but to which extent does our experience of the haptic, of touching, and I think, don't get me wrong, I think there is a wonderfully interesting avenue to be explored in relation to the notion of pressure in conventional printmaking and in mokuhanga through the application of the baren. I think that's quite different, a different form of pressure. But I mean, I don't yet know how that would be conceptualized, but it's certainly something that interests me a lot. Yeah, so I guess, where was I going with this? The touch, all I was trying to say, I wasn't denying that touch has this side, but what you are saying is also touch is deceptive, and we can fool ourselves with touch. So it's more to bear in mind what the actual implications of that are for making work. I'm not quite sure, but to bear in mind that these other sides also are present in the notion of touch. And I suppose we talk about our hands a lot and the involvement of skin. And in a sense, you know, I totally agree with you, Carol, about the emphasis on vision that has historically been given in Western culture, at least, to vision. And touch has been one of the neglected senses, but at the same time, there's also the idea, as the philosopher Mark Taylor says, that the point where I make contact with the world, I'm always already dead, because our skin, I didn't know this, actually the layer of the skin consists of dead cells. So if we take that seriously, then there is this other side. That's just an example to bring in the other side, I guess. I shut up now, before Ralph shuts me up.
Faith has got a question.
I wanted to touch on a couple of things, and one is just touch and how beautiful that presentation was. And I think through the pandemic, we've become aware of a couple of things, like there, you know, when you teach, and I work mostly with children, just to pat them on the shoulder or something, it just has such a huge impact. And I think that is one of the great benefits of mokuhanga, is that it is so tactile, that they're using their bodies, and how important that is now when there's so many young, you know, teenagers that just live in their basement playing video games. So how hugely important touch is. And then just about Harriina, I wanted to say, wow, you really opened my eyes. I had no idea how many animal products were in what we do, but also the sort of realism, or the idea of we can gradually work towards these things, because it can't be something we can do overnight. So it's that balance, or you might say the middle path of how to accomplish these things. But I thought they were both really amazing talks. I guess I don't have a question more than just thank you. That was very enlightening. Okay.
Thank you. That's great. Ralph, oh, you didn't want to?
Oh, I was just going to say about the animal products in mokuhanga. I think if there's a balance, that it's fine to use animal products. And Jennifer had made a point that that a lot of the animal products that would have been used in traditional mokuhanga would have been waste products from you know, eating or whatever, or from the from fish and so on. But in a holistic sense, you know, the human race now, it's not just, it's how we exploit forests, it's how we exploit nature. that is the big problem in that we should be thinking about, not just not specifically, you know, animal products in mokuhanga, for example.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I think Harriina has already said something about that. You know, that obviously with her paper that's not what she was driving at. But okay, I think we've got Andrew.
Myself? Yeah. I think I was rather shocked when I went into a brush shop in Tokyo about the kinds of hairs that are used in the many kinds of brushes that are available in some of the brush shops. You just don't think about. I grew up in a suburb of Florida where, you know, the neighborhood called Fox Hollow had never seen a fox for the last 100 years. So finding a brush that was called rat eyelash, or the brush used for lacquer floors, which is made from women's hair, human hair, or the tanuki brush, or the horsetail, or the goat fur. They weren't just waste products, because there are a lot of animals that you would certainly not have been waiting for the rats to lose their eyelashes naturally. So it was very helpful to become suddenly cognizant of the fact that these are definitely products that have been taken from animals for our purposes. And it was amazing to think that these things had all been found over hundreds of years to be the best item for a particular thing, many of which I didn't know existed, either the product or the need to do such an activity. So it made me very cognizant of the use of animal products in a way I'd never been before. And I have some of those brushes and I use them. And so I'm very much aware each time that I use my rat eyelash brush that somewhere there's a rat without eyelashes.
Okay, thank you. That was more a comment, I take it, not so much a question. Yeah. Well, I was wondering how do we determine the hapticity, the sense of touch in the products, in the actual images? What makes them, what makes a viewer aware of this sense of touch, do you think? One already talked about the haptic vision, which is described as, I don't know, how would you describe it? It's opposed to the optical, I think I can explain it best. The optical vision would be if one looks through the screen of a car driving and it's raining. So the optical vision ignores the rain on the glass, on the windshield, what is it called, window, and looks towards the road, because if you're driving, that's what you have to do. You have to get the full picture. That is the optical vision that takes in the bigger picture. The haptic vision is the close-up view, as it were. So that would be looking at the drops of rain on the windshield, for example, and the pattern that makes and the specific properties of those. So in a sense, I think when Laura Marks started her book, which she wrote in the early 2000s, she was kind of hoping to make a beeline for haptic vision as being more kind of revolutionary, more liberatory, but she withdrew that because she realized that we need both optical and haptic vision. So I suppose in terms of looking at a print, if we go with a print on the wall, then taking in the whole scene would be the optical vision, and the haptic vision would be, you see people often going very, very close up with their noses to the glass, if there's a glass, or to the paper if there isn't. And the kind of properties one beholds at close vision. But I'm still curious how mokuhanga people would define that haptics of mokuhanga at the level of vision, because that's how we can't touch them when we're not, those us who are not making them. what makes up the haptic of Mokuhanga.
I think the haptic vision is a very close up view, a very immersive view of the scene where maybe the participant's body is not visible, and where attention is drawn to little details, like in Goto-san's baren wrapping. He talks about how his fingertip would normally make a little scratching sound if he hasn't rubbed the fibers properly, and then he points out how to rub the fibers. So he's shown us through sensation, his body frame, what we should be aiming for if we want to do it. And we start to imagine with our bodies the kind of pressure, the kind of movements that we should make to emulate his performance.
Yeah.
So I think he very much, he quite successfully points us to a haptic vision, because we can't actually see what he's doing. And some of the things he does, he doesn't even explain. He goes, twist this a few times, you know, and then he does this incredible elaborate twirl, and you're like, how did you do that? So we have to imagine, using the view from the camera, the sensation of our muscle movements in order to replicate what we're imagining he's dealing with. So there's this gap of information.
Well, that's a very nice insight, but that still doesn't answer my question. How, you know, how in a finished print can we describe the haptics of a Mokuhanga print as opposed to another form of print?
Well, if I can, I don't want to hog the floor, but I think a lot of people flip the print over and look at the back, and it's a very common thing to do.
Yeah, but you can't do that in an exhibition. I do believe there is a haptics to Mokuhanga, you know, otherwise I wouldn't be asking that question. But I'm interested where you, or how you locate it. How would you describe it?
The baren suit.
Oh, we've got some answers there. I don't know who was first. Judith?
I think Michael was first, but
oh, okay.
My background is sculpturing, so I have a lot with this feeling, but of things. I was thinking actually doing things wrong in Mokuhanga, or the Japanese. As we learned, we don't show that we do some. We don't show the baren, the movement of the baren. We want to have it flat, but to show this feeling more. For example, and that could be a thing. Just not thinking about that it should be a beautiful flat color. Is learned in Mokuhanga, but maybe show the structure, as well as the inks, now Wanji, as she told us yesterday about. I forget the name of it, but the fault of all the points you get when you print wrong, but then you feel it in a way. So for me, you know, I'm not so well in Mokuhanga because I do the Western printmaking technique as well. But when I have a good feeling with my print, and maybe it's wrong, you know, maybe in Mokuhanga background, but when I think it's what I want to reach, then it's okay. So if it's wrong in Japanese eyes, or then it doesn't matter for me. But so
thank you.
Sorry, Ruth, I don't want to spoil anything as usual, but I think if we can take Michael and Patty's questions that they have already raised their hand, and then is the other two presentation time.
Okay, thank you. I'm so confused with the time. I'm so sorry. Michael?
Yes, thank you. You know, I've been away for a while, so I might have missed a few things, but I find this discussion really interesting. And I think for me, the main difference is that even so the word print comes from pressure, when doing mokuhanga, you don't really need that much pressure. It's enough that the paper touches the ink. And so it's the element of the haptic experience here is in the fact that the ink is not staying on top of the paper. It's not pressed on top of it. It's moving inside of the paper. So the elements touch. It's a soft way to bring the elements together that form the print, and it's a very sensitive work, sensible work and sensitive thing to do that. So it's not that heavy pressure that you would think about when you speak about printmaking. It's a soft touch to do that, and I think a lot of the prints in Japanese technique show that soft touch, that light feeling, that it's not that heavy, that the paper and the pigment are fused together in a very, very light way. And I think that's something that you can see, and this gives you a haptic experience about the quality of the print and the material that was used to form that work.
That's really interesting. I mean, I couldn't have described it like that. I mean, I know that there is this particular haptics to mokuhanga print, but I think you've described it very beautifully. And I suppose this texture of the paper does come into it as well. That adds to that lightness. Yeah. Thanks, Michael. Yeah. Okay, Patty.
Thank you. I just wanted to add a couple of things. And one is I used to work with the College Women's Association of Japan, the print show in Tokyo. And they have a section of their exhibition which is for visually impaired, where people come to touch the prints. So normally it'd be the prints which might have embossing or some other kind of tactile surface. And then the other thing is I come to mokuhanga from painting and installation and using other materials. And one of the things that struck me about the water-based method, where oil painting or maybe even oil-based woodblock, it's kind of a spectacular look, you know, it's shiny and it's bold, and you notice it when it comes in the room, when you come in the room. But mokuhanga has a really different feel. And this is something we're putting up an exhibition now in Vermont, and that I want to bring attention to is what does it feel like to be in a room where all of the materials are friendly to nature? Like, what is that sensation? And there's a way, I think of it as, you know, the difference between being on a fiberglass boat or a wooden boat. There's a sensation that you have, which is maybe more like cozy than spectacular, or it's deep rather than sensational. And I would love to explore that idea more. What are the words that describe that feeling? I can feel it. I don't know if I can say it. Just that.
I think Michael has made, don't you think Michael has made a very good start of describing it? Maybe we need also some, a poetic way of talking about it. Of course, the language can never render a work of art fully, neither should it, but I think we can make some move towards it. And yeah. So that lightness that Michael spoke of and softness captures it very well for me. But I'm sure there are other ways of approaching it, maybe poetically. Okay, so Mara has already